Hey, it's Rob and welcome to Axel's Garage. We're out here with Wanda. Now this is the second 2000 XJ. This is the one that's a little rough around the edges. Wanda's been rode pretty hard. So 193,000 miles on Wanda, a lifetime of neglect. And what I mean by that is the previous owner was the original owner. And just from the condition and talking to him, you know, over the weeks that we were buying it, because it took a while to get it home, as you know from a previous video, it seems like he didn't do anything to it until something was wrong. So we drove it home and started using it, got the brakes straightened out a little bit temporarily, and just started using it. I've been driving it back and forth to work just to see how she does. And we go and we dump the oil for the first time. So right before we checked the oil. It was black as black could be, and we put some seafoam in. So we used some seafoam in the oil, followed the directions, added it to the oil, drove it around for about 100 miles or so, dumped that oil out. That oil was nasty, dirty, black, grimy oil. So we put fresh oil in it and seafoam again as per the directions. I think it was like 6 ounces of seafoam into the 6 quarts of oil that go in the car, and we started driving it regularly. Now what we noticed in this vehicle is 2 oil issues. The one is the common Jeep, whether it's a 4-liter or a 2.5 4-cylinder, common problem. You start it up, you get great oil pressure, and as it warms up, the oil pressure starts to dive off until it hits 0 on the gauge and the light comes on that says check gauges. A little bit of a gremlin, and not just this one, but our Amanda's TJ has the same issue, goes down to 0. You don't have 0 oil pressure, because you can tell from the way the engine sounds you do have oil pressure. You turn the car off, let it sit. After it's warmed up, let it sit for a half hour, 45 minutes, an hour. I noticed it as I ran into a store. So I drove the car, got it hot, oil pressure went down to 0, turned it off, went into the store, came out 45 minutes later, started the car up, and no matter how long I drove it, that oil pressure never went down to 0 again. So there's a little bit of a, whether it's an electronic issue, whether it's a sludge issue in the motor, we don't know. But we know that we're not at 0. So we're really not battling that demon today. What the demon that we're battling is, when we start this thing up, cold, and it doesn't have to be cold out, like today's about, what, 55 degrees, Robbie? You got the big dummy Robbie behind the camera, and it's about 55 degrees. It's a little chilly for shorts, but it's not, you know, cold out. But you start the engine up cold, and it sounds fine. No strange noises or anything. Oil pressure is good on the gauge. But as soon as you put a little bit of a load on the engine, you hear the valves, the lifters, I should say. You hear the lifters just clanking away. And if you let it warm up for about a minute and a half, you can drive away, no lifter sound. But if you let it warm up for about 15-20 seconds, get in it like you would normally just jump in the car and run to the store quick, your lifters are making noise for the first minute or 2 of operation. Then it goes away completely, never comes back. No matter how low that oil pressure gets on the gauge, the lifter sound never comes back. And all the research I could do and all the people I could talk to could say that it's a combination of old oil varnish and gunk getting stuck on the lifters. And as the oil warms up a little bit, it frees that up. The temperatures increase inside the engine, which expand the metals, and the oil gets up there. It gets a little bit thinner. I don't know. I don't necessarily believe any or all of it. All I know is that it's an oiling issue, and I want to try to figure it out, because I know when Steven gets this thing, he's not going to be sitting there warming it up for a minute and a half, 2 minutes. He's going to get in it, start it up. I'm lucky if I get 15 seconds, and he's going to drive away. So we want to try to solve that problem. So step 1, we changed the oil and did a seafoam wash in that dirty original oil. It came out black. Then we put oil back in it, put seafoam back in it, and drove it for about 200 or 300 miles. So 200 or 300 miles of driving. It got better, but didn't go away yet. So we said, okay, we're going to try the old school ATF. So we just took standard ATF, generic ATF, and we put a half a quart in, because it was a half a quart low on oil, because it does leak a little bit, which is a topic for a different video. But we put a half a quart of ATF in and drove it another 250, and it definitely got better. Didn't solve it yet. So our plan is to, being that we only have about 500 total miles on the new oil change, is as it drops some level, we're going to keep adding ATF only until we add a quart. I wouldn't really feel comfortable putting more than a quart of ATF in with the engine oil. Cutting that down at I mean, there's 6 quarts of oil in this, so 5 quarts of oil, 1 quart of ATF in the end. And then we're going to dump the oil. And then we're going to try some of these products. Now, this one here, the Rizlone, I don't know, engine treatment. It's been around forever. I've never used it personally. I've used some of the cheap motor flushes, but this seems to be a problem solver for a lot of people that have these Jeeps, and we're going to try it. I'm going to try it, and we're going to let you know. And so that'll be the next one, and then we're going to go, in the end, we're going to go with the Lucas. When we do our final oil change, we're going to use Rotella oil, we're going to use a good oil, a good filter, and we're going to use the Lucas heavy-duty oil stabilizer to see if that will hopefully solve our problem in the end. So I'm going to take you along with us on this journey, and what I want to do now is this car's been sitting for about 24 hours. Hasn't been moved. Like I said, it's a little chilly. It was chilly overnight. It was probably in the 40s overnight. Not cold out by any means. So I'm going to start it up, and I want you to hear what's going on. All right, so just looking at the cold engine, I would say about a half a quart low. The oil's fairly clean, which I'm happy with in a way that it's not dirty. That one flush might have done it. On the other hand, I'm hoping that I get more crap out putting the seafoam and the ATF in. So we're gonna top it off with a little ATF, but before we do that, so probably a quarter of a quart or so. So then we'll have 3/4 of a quart total in here, and we'll give it a couple of 100 more miles driving it. The only issue is we tend to not have far trips, so it gets hot, but it doesn't get hot for a long time, which doesn't help getting that oil to wash all the crap away. Helicopter, of course. All right, so we're gonna start it. It's got a sluggish starter. We know that. We had some starter issues when we bought it. That's why it took 3 weeks to actually pick it up and get it home, which you guys already know from watching the intro to Wanda video. So, but we're gonna start it, and you're gonna listen to the engine, and then I'm gonna put it in gear and just give it a hair of gas just so you can hear what I mean by the lifters. And they are better than they were, but they're just not there yet. All right, so starting it up, sounds pretty good. I got good oil pressure, and now I'm just gonna put it in gear. Now if I leave it in park or neutral and let it warm up for, you know, a minute and a half, that's going to go away completely. My oil pressure will stay constant. It'll be about 50 psi on the gauge, but it's going to stay constant. So sitting here warming up, you know, we're about 50 psi on the gauge, which it's not an accurate, you know, factory gauge. It's sort of like a combination between an idiot light and a gauge. But we're at 50, and it'll stay like this for a decent amount of time. It'll go to 40, 30. It'll take some time for it to come down. But by the time the temperature reaches normal operating temperature, this gauge will be at 0. It's gonna filter off when it hits just around 10. It drops all the way down to 0. So what we're thinking is the way these gauges are designed, when they get to the recommended minimum, which I believe on these is 13 psi. So when the gauge thinks it sees 13 psi, it drops off to 0 because it wants to warn you that you're below the safe operating range. Doesn't mean that that's what's going on in your engine, because remember, it's an electronic sending switch, sending the signal over to this gauge. Not 100% accurate.
It's actually dropping now.
Yeah, it'll start to drop as it warms up. It'll start to drop off. Like you see, the temperature gauge just started to come up a little bit from the bottom. Now it's at 100, and that'll start to go down as the temperature goes up. Okay, so threw a sweatshirt on because we're gonna go to the restaurant supply and it's cold in there, and started it up. Hopefully that little run that we gave you to do a little demo doesn't mess up the oil gauge thing, but this is where we're at. Right, so our temperature is just over 100, and our oil pressure is at 40. And now we are going to drive to the restaurant supply now. It's New York. Oh, I'm dark again. Let the camera catch up. There we go. So it's New York, and it's going to be about a 2-mile drive, which is probably going to take 15 minutes. And it's stop and go with street lights, but it'll heat the engine up. It's not going to give me, that's what I'm saying, like we don't take it on a lot of trips right now, where we're really circulating the oil for an extended period of time. That probably would be a good run, I think, is what this thing needs also. But I'll show you when we get there what that oil gauge looks like. Well, we made it the 15-minute drive, and of course, because I'm making a video on it, the gauge didn't go down to 0. And now I'm convinced that the reason why the gauge isn't down at 0 now that I'm sitting here in the parking lot idling is because we had started it up and let it warm up just a little bit. And that warming up just a little bit, turning it off, for some reason, makes the gauge not go all the way down to 0. And it hangs right above 10 PSI, and I'll show you that. So here we are fully warmed up, and it's just above 10 PSI, and it never goes any lower than that now. So that's the weird thing. It's never going to go any lower. Now, when you're driving, it's going to come up around 40, and it's going to stay at 40 when you're driving. But when you stop at a light or you park and you're at idle is when it goes down to 0 usually. And now because we warmed it up, turned it off, and then went on a trip, it doesn't do it. That's what a good indicator that the gauge isn't reading accurate, and the vehicle does have oil pressure. It's not making any sounds. It's not doing anything funny. It's actually running very well, very quiet, and the oil pressure is holding at what looks like 11 PSI on the gauge. We're going to put an actual mechanical gauge on it, just a test gauge, just to see what it's actually at. So this is where we are. Now, if I would have started this from a dead cold and drove here, even a mile drive is enough to warm it up where that gauge is going to drop off to 0. So I don't necessarily believe that it's the sending switch. I don't know if it's in the circuitry. I don't know if it's the connector. Maybe it isn't making good contacts. We'll approach that on a different day. This video was pretty much to tell you about what our plan of action is to try to get the lifters quieted down and to sort of start figuring out what's going on. All right, well, I forgot to turn the power on the mic, so you'll have to listen to me do a little voiceover. So what we did was we drove it around. We got the seafoam in, we have the ATF in, and we gave it a couple of 100-mile drive. On this particular day, I got the oil good and hot so I could give it a good change. So I drained the oil out, and I left it draining for a while to try to get every last bit of that sludgy, dirty, really black and mucky oil out. So we got it all out, put a fresh filter on, and now we're going to fill it with the Rizlone or Rizzoline or Rizline or however you say it. And we're going to fill it up with that, and we're going to use a jug of 1030 motor oil, just a regular Walmart house brand motor oil. And we're going to put that in and hopefully try to get that to clean out the sludge. So now we're doing this for 2 reasons. Number one, we have that cold start lifter noise, and that's usually attributed to a lot of deposits from the oil and varnish and sludge and stuff inside the engine. So we're trying to clear that out. The second thing we're trying to do is solve or at least diagnose that low oil pressure on the gauge. We know we have oil pressure. That's not an issue. We could, put a mechanical gauge onto the tap for the sending unit for the oil pressure gauge if we wanted to. And we'll probably do that in a future video just to prove to everyone that we do have decent oil pressure, or to see what the oil pressure is. But this is the third Jeep that had a neglected past that we've had that has this same oil pressure issue. And just to be clear on what it is, this is I guess early spring when we filmed this video, and we were having that problem. We would start it up when it was cold, and once the engine warmed up, the oil pressure would go to 0. And then when we started it up, a half hour later, while the engine was still warm, the oil pressure would never get that low again on the gauge, not the actual pressure, the pressure reading on the gauge. And as we got into the warmer weather, we realized that, hey, it never goes to zero anymore because the ambient temperature was warm and that oil in the engine was warm already. And driving it through the summer, it never had that issue. And we attributed that to a lot of the sludge issues. So we're going to try to clean the sludge out, and we're going to report back to you in the next video on how we proceed with this oil change thing going on. Thanks for watching.